Thanks again, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate your participation. So today we're going to be doing a webinar on the rights of LGBTQ plus students in New York. Um, this uh, this webinar is being recorded. It will be posted to our website if you want to watch it later. We will also be emailing out to participants the PowerPoint presentation that we're going through, and that will be also will be posted to our website and YouTube page as well. So you can always access the information there. My name is Erica Palmer. I am an attorney at Advocates for Children, and I'm here with my colleague Anna. Anna, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Brem, and I am an advocate with Advocates for Children.
All right, great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So today we'll be doing a brief overview of, just LGBTQ issues, terms, things that are going on in the press that I'm sure you have heard about. We will then talk about gender and sexuality at school and really focus on the New York City and New York State policies that are in place to support LGBTQ students in New York City and New York public schools. Then Anna will talk about bullying. She'll talk a little bit about options for students who maybe feel like they need to transfer schools or want to transfer schools, and briefly discuss student discipline and students in temporary housing as it relates to the LGBTQ community specifically. And then we'll be sharing some resources and guides as well at the end, or links to those resources that we hope will be really helpful to you. There's a lot of very robust information on the New York City Public Schools website, sorry, as well as the State Education Department's website. So yeah, go ahead to the next slide. So what is Advocates for Children? As I stated, Anna and I work here at Advocates for Children. So we are an independent agency that protects the rights of all New York City students. We have been around for over 50 years at this point. We are a legal nonprofit that was started by parents of students with disabilities who were dissatisfied with the services and supports that their children were getting as students with disabilities in the New York City public schools. And so they came together to form our organization to fight for additional rights for their students. Over the many years, our mission has expanded to encompass supporting all kinds of students. So, of course, we still work on behalf of students with disabilities. That's a huge portion of our work here at Advocates for Children, but we have numerous projects that focus on a whole variety of populations. So, we have a project that is geared towards the need of older students who are transitioning out of high school into post-high school experiences. On the other hand, we have an early childhood project focused on very young kids who might need services in preschool or early intervention, as well as daycare and that moving on to kindergarten. And we have folks here at Advocates for Children that work directly with immigrant students who are learning English. We have a project focused on young people in charter schools, another one focused on students in temporary housing. We have a team that represents students at suspension hearings and help students that are maybe having behavioral or mental health challenges, and lots more. So we do a lot. And of course, today we're here to talk about the rights of LGBTQ plus students in particular. So Advocates for Children has a helpline. The number's on the slide. It's open Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So please, we encourage you to reach out if you have questions, if you need support for any of your students. And throughout the presentation, we will be referencing times when we would definitely recommend that you reach out to our helpline for support. If you go on our website, you'll also see there is a way to send an email to ask questions and get support that way as well. We have lots of guides and resources on our website, which again, you see linked on the slide, including a great guide on the rights of LGBTQ plus students in New York City public schools, but lots of guides about all the other topics we just talked about. In addition to running our helpline, of course, we do workshops and trainings and go out into the community and fairs to try to spread information and awareness about the rights of students in New York City public schools. And then finally, our main, I guess, task as an organization is to provide free legal services to students and families. So families who call our helpline can arrange or can request representation if needed. Of course, we cannot represent everyone who calls, but we certainly will give information and try to provide support to everyone who does reach out to us who needs support for their student. So that is a little bit about our organization. I don't see any questions, so we can go ahead to the next slide. Oops. All right. So again, to start off, we're going to start with some defining some shared language. So these are just basic terms or concepts to make sure everyone's familiar with. So of course, we're here talking about LGBTQ plus students. So what do we mean when we talk about the LGBTQ community? Letters, of course, we've got the acronym. So it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. Sometimes with young people, in context with young people or younger people, the Q will stand for questioning as well. Sometimes we get questions. What is the plus? What does the plus stand for? So really, that is meant to encompass all parts of the LGBTQ community that aren't specifically named in the acronym, right? So that could include um, gender identities and sexual orientations that we don't even have words for yet. Typically, we're thinking about things like you might have seen IA, right? That could be intersex, asexual, or aromantic. But also thinking about under other gender identities and sexual orientations as well. So, gender identities could be like non-binary, gender fluid, two-spirit. When we're thinking about other sexual orientations that aren't included in the acronym, it could be like pansexual, for example, or like I said, asexual. So really, it's just meant to be a term that can incorporate all aspects of the community, folks who don't identify as non-straight or who don't identify as straight or as cisgender identities. Which takes me to the next section, which what do we mean when we're talking about gender identity, right? So this is really a person's experience of their own gender, their concept of themselves as either masculine, feminine, or something else. It could be a blend of both. It could be a different gender. It could be no gender, right? So who they are, how they identify in or as a self. And so examples, um, cisgender essentially is someone whose gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. But you might hear terms like agender as someone who doesn't identify with any gender, or you could hear terms like gender queer, gender nonconforming, non-binary, and transgender, someone who identifies as a different sex as they were assigned at birth. Right. So we'll talk about, students with those identities and the support that they get and the support and rights they have within schools. And then we also wanted to briefly mention the other big concept, which is the concept of sexual orientation, right? And how that is part of the LGBTQ community. So sexual orientation, but when we say that, we mean a person's identity in relation to who they are attracted to physically, romantically, or emotionally. So not about who they are, but who they are attracted to. Very different things. The two are completely different concepts, right? And so we do just want to make that clear when sharing this information. And so again, some types of sexual orientations are listed on the slide. This is not all inclusive, but it could include asexual, bisexual, gay, lesbian, pansexual, so someone that, is attracted to all gender identities, queer, and questioning. So again, these terms change every year. We basically are updating this slide with different information. Language is always evolving, but we did just want to start with an overview of some of the basic terms when we're talking about gender identity, sexual orientation, and the LGBTQ community.
And
Moving to the next, oh, go ahead, Anna, sorry.
just as Erica moves on to the next piece, I'm just going to launch a poll in the background just to collect a little bit of information about who is here. So keep listening, fill out the poll behind the scenes.
Ah, thank you so much. I knew we forgot something. We'd always gonna forget something. So as I mentioned earlier, I am an attorney and Advocates for Children is a legal services organization. So we want to make sure you had access to the laws that pertain to this topic. So here are just some general laws that govern the space that we're going to be talking about today. Federally, we have Title IX. Which protects individuals from sexual and gender-based harassment and discrimination. We do have all of these laws are linked, so you can easily find more information about the laws online and also, steps to enforce your rights under these laws are also you can access through these hyperlinks here. So obviously Title IX federal law applies across the country. We also have New York State's human rights law, which is very robust, protecting LGBTQ plus students and other individuals. In New York City, we have chancellor's regulations. So these are local laws that govern New York City public schools only. Um, we have Chancellor's Regulation A 830, which is the Department of Education's anti-discrimination policy, and this pertains to staff to student discrimination. We will be speaking about this a little bit more in more detail later on in the presentation. We will also briefly mention Chancellor's Regulation A 831, which covers student to student sexual harassment, and then Chancellor's Regulation A 832, which is the anti-bullying regulation. It implements the Dignity for All Students Act, or DASA. DASA is the anti-bullying law that governs all of New York State. So this Chancellor's regulation is basically the local version of that state law. And like I said, we'll talk more about all of those things later on. So in addition, we wanted to be sure folks were familiar with some of the key New York City public school policies, which we will go into more detail with later. So two key ones for this population. New York City has very strong guidelines to support transgender and gender expansive students, as well as specific guidelines on gender inclusion that apply to all New York City public schools. New York City Public Schools also has a Student Bill of Rights that enumerates rights of various groups of students, including LGBTQ plus students. And those are also hyperlinked from the slides, so you can access them very easily when you get the presentation. So in addition to the New York City public school guidance, New York State also has very strong guidance on supporting trans and gender expansive students. It is linked from this slide. The New York City public school guidance is similar. It is just not as detailed. So I would say anyone whose student goes to school in a school district outside of New York City, or you're working with a student who attends a charter school, please refer to the New York State Education Department guidance. It is excellent and it has lots of details and specific examples for schools on how to best handle situations to support LGBTQ plus students. We're going to mostly be talking about the New York City Public Schools guidance, but like I said, it's similar and it incorporates all of the rights and protections that are included in the state guidance. And I see Anna answered the question, but yes, we will definitely be sharing the slides so you will be able to access everything. We did briefly want to mention two statements that were made by both the New York State Education Department and the New York State Attorney General, as well as a statement from New York City Public Schools. They both came out in February. And essentially, these were in response to executive orders that were issued at the beginning of the Trump administration. Anna, if you go to the next slide, we can talk about each of them individually. So as I'm sure folks remember, when President Trump was sworn in last year, there was a lot of executive orders that went out, right? There was a flurry of executive orders in those first 30 days, and two of them were specifically about trans students and their rights in public schools, right? So these two executive orders were attempting to restrict schools from supporting trans students' social transition and also their access to athletics, so their ability to play sports essentially in school. And so the New York State Attorney General and the New York State Education Department, in response to these executive orders, issued a statement that said these do not affect the rights of trans students in New York State public schools. And that is because, in part, because we have very strong state protections so that these students are still able to, participate in athletics and have their gender identities recognized and supported in public schools, right? So the reasons behind it, according to the statements, even the executive orders are simply orders, from the president. They are not legislation, they are not law, and so they cannot restrict the meaning of sex in Title IX. It would take an act of Congress to amend Title IX to exclude gender identity. So legally, Title IX is still in place, and folks have the right to not be discriminated against because of their gender identity, right? So that's one aspect of it. As I stated earlier, New York State has a lot of other legal protections. They have its own human rights law, as well as the policies we mentioned, that provide additional protections to students, and school districts have to follow state law, right? They don't get to pick and choose. So because of that, students in New York continue to have the protections. And then finally, funding from the federal government that might cause school districts districts to act differently is decided through legislation and Congress, not necessarily through executive orders. So again, the state is confident and has continued to state that that LGBTQ students in New York State will continue to have access to these protections. Um, so there are some updates we wanted to share. Again, you may have heard about this in the news. So in response to some of those statements and additional policies, last fall, the Trump administration pulled New York City's magnet school funding um, over the city's policies that support trans students that we're going to be speaking about momentarily. So, in response, the city actually sued the U.S. Department of Education to have that funding restored. And back, it was about 6 weeks ago now, there was a federal district court that ruled that the U.S. Department of Education didn't follow the proper procedures, and therefore they must restore funding to the New York City public schools. And they gave them 10 days to basically correct the errors or to restore the funding. As far as we know, there were no attempts made by the U.S. Department of Education to correct the errors they made when they initially made this funding decision, and so the funding therefore has been restored to the city. There has also been news within the last 6 months or so. You may have heard that the Department of Education is investigating New York City public schools over trans students' participation in sports. We're not the only school district. There are 14 others, as well as the state of Hawaii and some higher education institutions who are also being investigated. However, we haven't heard anything more about that, right? And so, at least for now, things remain as is, and all of the laws and policies that we're going to be talking about continue to be in place. And New York City public schools, as well as the New York State Education Department, continue to affirm their commitment to transgender students, and all of these policies remain in place. So, really important to keep all that in mind. I know we hear a lot about the news and it's very disconcerting, but knowing that these policies are still in effect, we wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that and could feel confident in that. So, what do the policies say? So, in New York City, as well as New York State, LGBTQ plus students have the right to feel safe at school, be safe from bullying, harassment, and discrimination, be out or not at school, and freely express their gender identity. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in detail in the next upcoming slides. So we get a lot of questions about names and pronouns. What does it take to change your names and pronouns? Do schools need to honor it? What are the rules? So schools must address students by the name and pronoun that that student uses. It does not require a legal name change or parents' consent. Schools are required to use the name that the student has chosen for themselves to express their gender identity at school, as well as their pronouns. Refusing to do so and intentionally referring to a student, either verbally or in writing, by their dead name or by pronouns that are misgendering that student, is equal to bullying and harassment. So legally, it constitutes bullying or harassment under the laws we just talked about, right? And schools would be guilty of discrimination by intentionally misgendering a student or using the wrong name. School principals are responsible for enforcing the policy, both with staff and with other students. So they must ensure that staff are honoring the student's name and pronouns, and that other students are using the correct name and pronouns as well. When parents are enrolling their child in a Department of Education or New York City public school for the first time, students can and should give their pronoun and preferred name. So the pronouns and names that they use that affirm their gender identity, they are self-reported and they don't require documentation. So if someone is enrolling in New York City public schools for the first time, they provide their name and gender, and that is what the school is going to be using. And we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between official and non-official records, but just know in general, when referring to students, schools are required to use the correct name and pronouns that reflect their gender identity. When we're talking about updating or changing school records, we have different rules for non-permanent records and permanent records. For non-permanent records, you just have to ask. And there is no documentation required to update a student's name or gender marker. So examples of what we're talking about when we say non-permanent records are things like school ID cards, middle school or elementary school diplomas, guidance counselors' logs, graduation programs, sports rosters, or yearbooks. Really, if there's any kind of event and you're listing a list of student names, that is not a permanent record, and schools don't need any type of documentation to use the student's name and gender marker well, you wouldn't be using a gender marker, but their name that aligns with their gender identity. For permanent school records, the student's information will need to be updated in the New York City Public Schools computer system. We call that ATS. And it does require parental consent unless the student is over 18 or they're emancipated. So examples of what we're talking about when we're talking about permanent school records are things like report cards, transcripts, um, individualized education programs. Um, or any types of special education or disciplinary records. So those are considered permanent records. And again, they require parental consent unless the student is over age. If the school has questions about how to do it, we've included an email address for like a general inbox. And sorry, for some reason, here we go. It's LGBTQ at schools.nyc.gov, and we're going to show that email several times throughout the presentation, but they are an office within DOE that supports LGBTQ students, and schools can reach out to them with questions as well as families. So, how do you update permanent school records? There's basically two ways. If the student is still enrolled in school, which is mostly going to be the case, um, there's you can do it obviously with a legal name change. And we have information here about basically you have to go to court, get the legal name change, and then bring in the documentation so that the school can update the student's information in ATS. However, if you don't have a legal name change, there is a form that the parent can submit. It's called the Name and Gender Change Request Form. The parent just signs it, and then the school can move forward with updating the ATS, the New York City Public School Computer System. And as it states here, if the student is over 18, they can update the form themselves. I see a quick question. Can a person's preferred pronouns identity be added to an IEP? And how can a parent prove misgendering impedes learning or have it added? So certainly, the student's preferred name should be and pronouns should be used in the IEP. If the parent is in agreement and this is what the parent's request, they simply need to fill out that form. The student's name and gender will be changed in ATS, and then the IEP should reflect that, right? They're all connected, so the IEP should reflect that, and the staff that are creating the IEP and all the other documents would be updated with that. In terms of proving misgendering, I mean, if a student is being misgendered, and as we said, it's continuous, it's intentional, it's not like a one-off here and there that someone made a mistake, but it's obvious that the person is continuing to misgender the student. You don't, as far as I'm concerned, you don't need to prove that it impedes the student's learning. We know that it does, right? It's considered de facto discrimination under the chancellor's regulations. And so it's imperative that the school is using their correct language and that there's repercussions if anyone, whether it's a teacher or someone on the IEP team, a special education provider isn't using the right name and pronouns, it needs to be included in all of that information, and schools need to enforce that. You can also change school records after a student leaves or graduates. This is probably most common when someone needs an updated um, diploma or an updated high school transcript. Basically, they just need to reach out to the old school with documentation of the legal name change or change in gender marker, and then the school will work with the academic policy office to update the Department of Education's computer system so that a new transcript can be generated for that individual. All right. I think, yes, we can go on to the next slide. So these are some other issues that come up in schools in addition to name and pronoun use. We had a lot of questions about bathrooms and locker rooms. So the laws and the policies are very clear here in the city and state guidance. Students have the right to use the bathroom or locker room that aligns with their gender identity, full stop, and schools cannot force students to use either a locker room or restroom that conflicts with their gender identity or an alternative facility like a gender neutral room or a single occupancy restroom. unless the student wants it, right? So it's really based on it's student driven. If the student needs or wants extra privacy, they can certainly request, and the school must let them use a gender neutral or single stall bathroom, whether that's an accessible bathroom, the teacher's bathroom, one in the nurse's office, something else, right? One for adult visitors, whatever the case may be, but it needs to be based on the student's requests. And if a student wants to keep their transgender status confidential, their changing schedule, their, restroom they use must allow them to do so. So we see this come up potentially if students are changing for PE, or if they're participating in sports teams, which we'll talk about in a moment. Just making sure that the whatever, restroom or changing facility is provided to the student, it should be based on their request and what they need. All right, we can go on to the next slide. Just wanted to talk a little bit more about the gender inclusive school-wide policies. So we've been talking about ways that students are required to support and affirm that schools, sorry, are required to support and affirm individual students' gender identities. But in addition, it's very important that schools as a whole are enforcing gender neutral policies and practice. So, as an initial matter, according to the Department of Education's Style Guide, schools should be using gender neutral language in all their written communication. So, what that looks like is they're saying dear students, not dear boys and girls. They're using they pronouns instead of she, her. Um, they are just really not separating, right? Students based on gender for unnecessary reasons. We do have some single gender schools in New York City, and they are allowed. However, students are eligible to attend those schools based on their gender identity asserted at school, even if it's not documented in the school's computer system, and even if it, doesn't align with their gender assigned at birth. Importantly, schools need to be very careful about what practices they have in the school building and remove any policies or practices that don't serve a clear instructional purpose. So, some examples are like basic things like students lining up by gender when they're traveling from the cafeteria to the classroom, gender-based superlatives, having different dress codes, right? Like all of these things don't serve any instructional purpose and so are not allowed. Dress codes need to be gender neutral. Rules, teams, all of that. You don't have boys versus girls in class when you do activities, things like that. And students must be allowed to participate in school activities according to their gender identity. That also applies to things like field trips. So as I stated earlier, dress codes must be gender neutral and student clubs must be open to all. So you're not going to have like a girls coding club, for example, right? It's a student coding club. Anyone can participate. In addition, health classes and sex ed must be inclusive, affirming, and can't be segregated by gender. We see this a lot. I know a lot of schools do segregate health classes by gender, but they are not supposed to. Um, Including sex education, it needs to be gender neutral, inclusive, everyone is coming, and there are specific curriculum that schools can follow. In terms of PE and sports, schools cannot separate by gender except for contact sports, and students have to be permitted to participate in physical education, intramural sports, athletic competition, and contact sports based on their gender identity. Another thing we see sometimes is for paired or partner activities. Schools cannot use gender specific roles. So if you're doing like dancing or square dancing in a gym class, you can't have a male and female role. It's this person is the lead, this person is following, and then you swap, right? So just really thinking about how can we design all of our classes, all of our clubs and activities so they're not excluding anyone because of their gender identity. All right. We also wanted to touch on privacy for students. We know this can come up a lot, particularly when there maybe are difficult relationships between home and school or between the student and their family situation, right? So many of you are familiar with FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. It applies to information about students' transgender status or gender identity and sexual orientation, as well as things when we think about education records, right? So schools need to consider when and whether it's necessary or relevant to disclose that information to outside parties, even to someone with permission under FERPA to have that information. So really what we're talking about is if a school knows that a student identifies as transgender or as gender non-binary, for example, and they are out at school, they may not be out at home, right? And so it's important for schools to really think about the student's health and safety and keep that foremost when thinking about what information needs to be shared with parents. Certainly, parents have an interest and right in knowing how their child is doing in school. And at the same time, we need to do everything we can to keep students safe. So particularly if you're looking at the New York City public school policy and the New York State education department's policy, they really stress that only the student knows whether it is safe to share their identity with caregivers. And so we really need to be following their wishes when we're thinking about what information needs to be disclosed. And of course, we need to think about that in general when disclosing information so it doesn't get back to folks that might put the student at risk. Um, when a student is maybe comes to a school personnel and is interested in transitioning at school, um, it's important for school staff to meet with the student and come up with a plan on how that's going to work, what the timeline will look like, how we'll change information in the school records, and how we can make sure that it's addressed sensitively in class and in the school environment in general. And I would encourage you to look at the state um, policy, the state guidelines. They have some really helpful tips and guidelines and for what to talk about in those meetings when a student is transitioning in school. If we go to the next slide, um, we also did want to put in a plug for GSAs, Gender and Sexuality Alliances. So these are student-run clubs that provide a safe space for LGBTQ plus students and their allies to meet, find support, plan activities, and think about how to, just operate safely in the school environment. There has been research showing that schools with active GSAs have less bullying related to LGBTQ identity. There's less harassment, and students report feeling safer or more comfortable in school when there is an active GSA. It's important to note that the Equal Access Act, which is a federal law, states that public schools cannot prohibit students from starting a GSA if there are other non-academic clubs at the school. So basically, if the school has clubs, um, then they can have a GSA. And so we want to make sure that students are aware of that in case we have a run up against that issue where students trying to start a GSA and not getting support from the school. So that was a lot of information about the school policies. Again, please refer to them for more details. They're very helpful. Um, we have links to the policies here. If you do have a student who's attending a school and the school is not following the policies appropriately, I would encourage you to refer them to the guidelines specifically and what the guidelines state. If that is not helpful, you can certainly speak directly with the Respect for All liaison. We'll talk more in a second about who that is and what they do, but you can refer to talk to them or the principal and kind of make a more formal complaint if the informal way doesn't help. If that still does not resolve the issue, you can email the Respect for All at schools.nyc.gov or call them at the number listed on the slide, and that would be the central office that supports schools with ensuring anti-bullying laws specifically. You can also email LGBTQ at schools.nyc.gov and reach out to them directly for support to intervene with the school. And then finally, if those informal procedures and escalation processes do not work, you can always file a complaint with the Office of Equal Opportunity. We have linked to the form online that you can use, or you can call the number on the slide and file a formal complaint that way. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anna to continue with the second half of the presentation.
Thank you, Erica. So we want you to know affirmatively what the rights of LGBTQ students in New York City are, but we also want you to be prepared if students do experience bullying, harassment, or discrimination. I will just, for shorthand, reference bullying as I'm talking, but know that when I'm saying bullying, I'm using that as shorthand for all three: bullying, harassment, or discrimination. So, like all New York City students, LGBTQ students are entitled to protection from bullying, harassment, and discrimination. Students are protected whether they self identify as LGBTQ or gender non-binary, or someone thinks that they do. So someone's perceiving them as LGBTQ and is bullying them as a result. So bullying can come in many forms. It can be physical, verbal, social, written, or electronic behavior. Cyberbullying being the electronic form. Any of those behaviors that leads to a hostile environment for the student at school. And so the definition of a hostile environment is that it affects the student's learning, that it affects their mental, emotional, or physical well-being, that it causes fear for their safety, and that it causes or could possibly cause physical injury or emotional harm. This applies regardless of the physical location where that bullying actually occurs. The DOE is responsible for addressing bullying that happens on school grounds or property, whether it's before school, after school, or during the school day, at school-sponsored events that are off-site, on school buses, and even outside of school, if it does in fact disrupt the student's learning, or it harms the school environment. So again, cyberbullying, perfect example. It might happen at 2 a.m. on a weeknight online. It's absolutely going to affect the student when they come to school on Monday. It affects their learning. It is bullying that the school is responsible for addressing. I also just briefly throw out school buses. Busing can be a little bit complicated because sometimes there's students from multiple schools on the same bus. This policy still applies. The student who's experiencing the bullying, their school is responsible for figuring out who is involved, working together with the schools of the other students involved in order to address the bullying. So there's under the Respect for All policy and under DASA, the Dignity for All Students Act, there's a few things that schools have to do proactively in addition to how they actually respond to bullying once it's reported. So we'll talk first about the proactive piece. So these are all things that schools have to do in order to prevent bullying. They have to create a plan to prevent and address bullying. They have to publicize Respect for All, so that DOE policy that we'll go into more detail about. They have to publicize it and share it with parents and students every single year. And they need to make the chancellor's regulation about bullying 832 available to parents. They need to train a Respect for All liaison. They have a Respect for All liaison on staff who needs to be trained every single year. They are the point person who's responsible for knowing and supporting their school in knowing all the policies and supporting their school in addressing bullying. And they need to train all students and staff on bullying policies every single year by October 31st. So it's something that students and staff should be hearing. It's repeated every single year. And then if bullying does occur, schools are responsible for reporting it, investigating it, and stopping it. So Respect for All, we mentioned this quite a bit. This is the DOE's program to promote respect for diversity and create inclusive school environments. The goal is that by providing a safe and supportive learning environment for all students, by preventing discrimination, harassment, intimidation, and bullying, you will create a safe, supportive learning environment for all students. So by promoting respect for diversity, you will decrease bullying, you will create a safe, supportive learning environment. Every school has to have someone on staff who's designated as the RFA liaison. So this is one hat that they wear on top of possibly many roles. It is oftentimes a guidance counselor or a parent coordinator or a school social worker, but they are specifically designated as the RFA liaison. And they are trained in bullying, discrimination, and harassment issues and the policies around them and best practices for actually responding to and addressing bullying. And the goal of that person's role is to actually prevent the bullying before it happens. But if it should happen, they are responsible for making sure that it is appropriately addressed. So let's say you are aware of a student who has experienced bullying. There's a few different ways to report it. You can report it just verbally, you can speak to the school, you can report it online by filling out a form that's linked here. You can call 311 or you can email Respect for All. That Respect for All email, the online form, and 311, all of those reports will start with the district and make their way down to the school. Or you can just go directly to anyone at the school. Anyone can report a student who actually is experiencing the bullying, just someone who witnesses it, a parent, a professional, anyone in the community. You can report to any school staff, uh, and you can report in person, by phone. We find that it's easiest to track when in writing. In email, you have a date that you sent the email, you have proof of who you sent it to. You can report in any language, and you can and should provide as much detail as possible. But we understand you may not have all the detail at the time you're making a report. Perhaps you've heard from a student that there's been an incident, and they don't want to share the names of the other students involved. Simply reporting as much information as you have is a good place to start. Once you do make a report, you should ask, if you're the parent of the student involved, you should ask for an ORS report. This is going to be a report of the incident that you have reported. The ORS stands for the Online Occurrence Reporting System. You'll get a report and a reference number, and it should be available within 24 hours of you actually making this report. It's also important to remember that you cannot be retaliated against for reporting bullying, and the student involved can't be retaliated against for reporting bullying. And if you feel that this has happened, this can and should be reported at the district level. We'll show you in a bit who those contacts are. Once a report is made, the school has to enter the report in the incident in ORS within 24 hours, and then the principal is responsible for conducting an investigation within 5 days. So if any school staff, sees or learns about bullying, they have to orally make a report to the Respect for All liaison or the principal within 1 school day, and file a written report within 2 school days. The RFA liaison or the principal then has to enter the report in ORS within 24 hours, or if the report's been relayed directly to the district, so perhaps through 311 or that online form that we talked about or the email, then it's relayed to the school anonymously, and that same process happens. Then with the investigation, the principal has 5 days to determine, did the incident occur and was it bullying? At that point, we would reach the decision stage. So let's say they decide that it was in fact bullying, it occurred and it was bullying, then they need to respond. They need to address what has happened, and they need to prevent it from happening again. The factors that a principal is going to consider when they're determining whether the behavior is bullying or harassment or discrimination are things like the age of the students, what happened, how serious is the behavior, how often has the behavior happened, and for how long, what's the context in which the behavior happened, how many students were involved, and what was the impact on the involved students' education. Schools have to inform the parents of both affected and accused students of the results of the investigation, but keep in mind that families of affected students are not entitled to know specifically how the DOE is addressing the bullying with the accused students. So for instance, if my child has experienced bullying, I am entitled to know that it was determined to be bullying and it is being addressed, but I'm not entitled to know specifically what measures the school is taking with the students who exhibited the bullying behavior. So for instance, if there was detention or a suspension, or what if any disciplinary actions were taken. All of that information needs to be communicated to parents in their language. And once we get, I mentioned this, but once we have a determination, it's not just about responding to the bullying, it's also about preventing the bullying from continuing or happening again in another form. So how do schools actually do that? Schools should recommend supports for all students involved. So on both sides of bullying, students who have exhibited bullying behaviors and who have experienced it. There's all sorts of supports that can be helpful, things like counseling, individual or in a group, positive behavioral supports, perhaps academic supports, emotional coping skills training, social skills, a safety plan, things like, actually, I'll go into that in the next slide. Um, Restorative practices, and for LGBTQ issues specifically, the LGBTQ office that Erica mentioned earlier can be of specific support. So we'll share this information in the resources later, but there are lots of really great, really thorough curricula about LGBTQ issues. And again, studies show that the more that these uh, groups are talked about and celebrated and referred to in an inclusive way in schools and in the community, the more likely that it is for students to be supported and welcomed by their peers as opposed to experiencing bullying and harassment based on their identity. So the safety plans that I mentioned, this is something that you can ask the school to meet, to discuss, to figure out something that would work given the specifics of your student's situation. Could be things like changing their seat in a classroom, changing their dismissal time. Maybe they leave 5 minutes early just to get out and done with dismissal before everyone else. Maybe you adjust their lunchtime, slightly adjust their schedule generally, designate a safe adult for the student to go to if they need help, asking staff to just keep a lookout, to notify staff that are working with the student. Maybe they've changed schools and you want to make sure that the team working with the student now know what has happened in the past. And you can also add things to the safety plan, like a buddy system with another peer, different ways that the school can address tensions or conflicts, and different ways that the student can self-soothe and develop some coping skills. And something that I always recommend is talking to the student in the situation. Oftentimes, the young person will have the the best and most informed ideas about what it is that would be helpful for them. So just to keep in mind with students with disabilities and bullying, families have the right to ask for IEP meetings to talk about any incidents that occur and their concerns. This is the case for students on either side of a bullying incident. You can ask the IEP team to mention bullying in the IEP and then add supports and services that might help. These could be very similar to what we talked about before, but they would just be documented and memorialized in the IEP, which is enforceable. You can also think about whether a functional behavior assessment and a behavior intervention plan could be helpful if the student's behavior is affecting their ability to learn and engage in their education. Okay, so let's say a school determines that there was no bullying or doesn't adequately address and prevent future bullying. There's a triage of steps that we would recommend that you take. First, talk to the principal. Then, if that doesn't work, email Respect for All. Then call the school superintendent's office, so the superintendent for your district, and then email LGBTQ at schools and contact us. You can, if you have dealt with this over and over and you feel that you know for sure that one of these steps is not going to work because it has not worked before, you can jump to it. You can jump ahead in this triage. But this is kind of the order of operations that we would recommend that you take. And when I say contact AFC, this is calling the helpline or emailing AFC info, like Erica mentioned at the beginning. If you do follow those steps and you're not satisfied with the school district's response, you have the right to a few different things. You can file an appeal with the New York State Commissioner of Education within 30 days. You can file a complaint with the New York State Department of Human Rights. There's an online form or a hotline number for that. Or you can file a complaint with the Federal Office of Civil Rights within 180 days. So just keep those timelines in mind if you do want to file any of those complaints. Okay, so just a few specific notes or specific processes for particular types of bullying. Student-to-student sexual harassment, Title IX and Chancellor's Regulation 831 protects students against sexual harassment by other students. To report this specifically, you can go through the standard bullying process, or you can contact the principal, the school's sexual harassment prevention liaison, or any school staff member. You can submit a complaint form. Again, this is specifically for sexual harassment to any school staff. You can submit a complaint online. You can email Respect for All, or you can email the Title IX coordinator at schools. For bullying or discrimination by school staff, whether against students or against family members, you can report this through, again, two different mechanisms. Corporal punishment or verbal abuse by staff. You can tell the principal. You can submit an Office of Special Investigations complaint online, or you can call the number listed here. For discrimination or harassment by school staff, you can contact the Office of Equal Opportunity via the online form or the number listed here. Okay, so if for any reason a student feels that they need to change schools, we hope that the school appropriately addresses and prevents the bullying like we talked about previously. Perhaps they don't do it soon enough and the student no longer feels safe at school, or they don't do it effectively and the student no longer feels safe at school. There's a few different pathways to changing schools. So a safety transfer doesn't require an incident of physical harm or a police report. We find that's a common misconception. You just need to have had a risk to physical, emotional, or mental health. And if you want to request a safety transfer to another school, you can ask the student school directly, or you can contact the Family Welcome Center. A guidance transfer is when there hasn't necessarily been risk to their physical, emotional, or mental health. But if they aren't progressing or succeeding academically or socially, and a new school would address those concerns, so like removing them from their current environment, if that would help, you can request a guidance transfer by contacting the Family Welcome Center with any supporting documents that show that the student isn't succeeding emotionally or academic or socially or academically. For a medical, oh, I see a question in the chat. How does the safety transfer work for a student with an IEP? That's a great question. So you can still contact sorry, my foot has fallen asleep. You can still contact the Family Welcome Center to request a safety transfer. They have access to the student's IEP and would be able to uh, make an offer based on a school that can implement what is on the student's IEP. You can also loop in the CSC directly for support. So if it's let's say, I would approach it that way for a 12-to-1 class or an ICT classroom for a student specifically with an IEP that recommends a District 75 program. I would contact the District 75 placement office. Medical transfers. If a student needs a new school because of physical disability, illness, pregnancy, or mental health needs, they are eligible for a medical transfer. And to request that, you would just need to submit a letter from the medical provider treating them, explaining the medical condition, and why the student needs to change schools. And then two other options, travel hardship. So if someone's traveling more than 75 minutes to school via public transportation, they would be eligible for a transfer. And to request that, you just need to bring proof of address to the Family Welcome Center. And then if a student is currently attending a charter school, they are always entitled to leave. They have the right to leave a charter school and attend a DOE school instead. And they can request a placement in a DOE school from the Family Welcome Center or appear at their zone school to register if they're in grades K through 8. So for all of these options, I do have to say you aren't entitled to your choice of school to transfer to. If you have a particular school in mind when you are asking for one of these transfer options, absolutely tell the Family Welcome Center that. Do keep in mind that, depending on the time of year, depending on seat availability, there may or may not be space at a particular school. Okay, a few other options, alternative school options. Oh, it looks like there's Um, a few other options, alternative schools. So, transfer schools are for students who are behind in credits. They often have smaller classes and can give more individualized supports or, individualized attention to students just by nature of their size. There are a few options we wanted to mention here specifically for the LGBTQ community. Harvey Milk was specifically designed for LGBTQ students and families and is a great option. James Baldwin is really supportive and inclusive. And then Broome Street Academy is a charter school that is a transfer school at the door. Um, Young adult borough centers, YABCs, often have evening programs for students who can't go to class during the day, still a pathway to earn a Regents diploma. And then finally, high school equivalency programs, so the GED. The DOE and many other community organizations offer free programs to prepare for the GED exam. Okay, LGBTQ students and discipline. So, unfortunately, research suggests that LGBTQ students experience higher rates of school discipline. So, we just want to affirm schools cannot discipline students based on their gender identity, their gender expression, or sexual orientation. They cannot retaliate against students for reporting bullying. And if a student faces school discipline for one of those reasons, either because of their identity or because they reported bullying, they should absolutely file a complaint with the Office of Equal Opportunity. And the complaint form is linked here. Also, if you hear about a student being suspended and receiving any information about a suspension hearing, you should call AFC right away. And I do see that there's a question in the Q&A that Erica is answering right now, and I'll circle back to it in a moment. LGBTQ students in temporary housing. So LGBTQ students have a much higher likelihood of residing in temporary housing, either because they have run away from home or oftentimes because they have fled. They are much more likely to experience homelessness than their straight peers, and trans students in particular are much more likely to experience homelessness. So we want to just remind you of the rights of students in temporary housing, regardless of whether a student is LGBTQ or not. Students without fixed, regular, or adequate housing may be considered or are considered students in temporary housing, or STH. Whether they're staying in a runaway or homeless youth shelter, temporarily sharing the housing of others, like couch surfing, or they're in another form of temporary housing, like a shelter. In all those cases, they're students in temporary housing. They're all protected by the McKinney-Vento Act and the DOE Chancellor's Regulation 780. Students in temporary housing are entitled to choose to remain at or return to their school of origin, so where they were attending before they entered shelter or temporary housing, or they can enroll in school near where they're staying. So let's say I was living in the Bronx and I enter a shelter in Staten Island. I can either stay in my school in the Bronx and get transportation, or I can transfer to a new school where I'm living in Staten Island. They're entitled to immediate enrollment without documentation. So if I move to New York City and I need to enroll in school in New York City, I don't need to provide the same documentation that I typically would in order to enroll in school, like proof of address, proof of identity, etc. And then students in temporary housing are also entitled to transportation to school. Depending on their age, they might be entitled to Omni cards, that used to be Metro cards, or busing. Unaccompanied youth are students in temporary housing who are not living with a parent or guardian. They have the right to make decisions about their own school enrollment without parental consent, and STH regional managers can help do that. We'll give you the contact information for those regional managers. They're assigned by school district. Unaccompanied youth can also apply for federal financial aid for college as independent students without having to provide their parent or guardians financial information on FAFSA. So essentially, they're applying without their parent or guardian's financial information being considered. We just want to show you where you can find the school-based supports that are available at your particular school. So this is the schoolsearch.schools.nyc website. You can search the name of a particular school here. Should be able to see my mouse. Type the school in here, search all, and then if you looked up a particular school and clicked on it, if you scroll down to mental health and wellness and you click the little caret or arrow so that the drop down menu expands, you'll see a list of the mental health and wellness supports available for that particular school. Some of the stuff that's listed is district wide, and then some of the supports will be like if there's a mental health clinic in-house at the school, that would be listed here. And now my mouse does not know where it is. Okay. If you click on the school contacts and information tab, then you'll get if you drop it down, you'll see the principal, the parent coordinator, the Respect for All liaison, sexual harassment prevention liaison, and the link to report bullying. The hyperlinks here will be for the school contacts email. We want to remind you of the resources that we mentioned at the start or throughout. The LGBTQ at schools email is a direct general inbox for all of DOE or all of New York City Public Schools. We've got the New York City Public Schools guidelines to support trans and gender expansive students, the guidelines on gender inclusion, and the Student Bill of Rights. These are all documents they're written in plain language, they're student friendly, they're parent friendly, they are not legalese. So we really recommend pointing schools to them if the school is perhaps not following any of the guidance laid out here. They can be a very good place to start to point really clearly to this is what it says on New York City Public Schools website. Then we've got the New York State guidance on supporting trans and gender expansive students. As Erica mentioned, this is really detailed and has a lot of great examples, particularly in the section about supporting students about coming out at school or transitioning at school and how to talk about what it is that they want at school. We have our own AFC guide for LGBTQ students. At the end of that guide, we've got lots of resources around New York City generally. New York City Public Schools has a web page that lists all sorts of LGBTQ student supports. So it has links to the curriculums that have been created about LGBTQ pride, about famous LGBTQ, all sorts of LGBTQ people. And then there is a webpage specifically for Pride Month. So this has a lot of not just reactive resources, so like not just information about what to do if a student is being bullied or what to do if a student's name is not being used at school, but it's also a lot of that like proactive information that we talked about, so that schools can affirmatively create an inclusive school environment. And then we've got the joint statement from the New York State Attorney General and the New York State Education Department on trans students' rights. So I'm going to move to the last couple of slides, and then I'll go back to the Q&A and summarize that. But I just want to get these links up there. This is the QR code to sign up for our newsletter, or you can type in this link. And then this is the info. I'll hover back on that, but this is the information about calling our helpline or sending us an email at AFC info.
I'm just going to go ahead and launch our ending poll to provide feedback, so folks can work on that while Anna's wrapping up.
And I just want to share the Q&A that was the question that was asked in the Q&A. I understand this webinar was specifically for students, but are there similar rights or does Respect for All apply to LGBTQ educators in New York City public schools? So Eric answered this in the chat, but I'm just going to read it out. So Chancellor's Regulation 830 provides protection against harassment and discrimination to all people in New York City public schools, including teachers, staff, and parents. You can find more information at the link provided. And then in addition, At the federal and the state level, Title IX, and at the state level, New York State human rights law applies to everyone, including educators and other school staff.